Welcome to Devotionary, where we make the Bible accessible and applicable. Up to this point in the story of David's life, there's been a concerted effort on the part of the author to differentiate between David and Saul. Their lives have been purposely juxtaposed by their antithetical natures. One was a man after God's own heart, while the other was a man from whom God had removed his spirit. David has been characterized by faithfulness and obedience, while Saul has been the poster boy for faithlessness and disobedience. And yet, in 1 Samuel chapter 28, verses 1 through 7, we're given a surprising glimpse into a similarity shared between these two men. They each had the habit of taking matters into their own hands. And in this one chapter, we're going to see what happens when anyone refuses to seek the will of God and chooses to manage their life on their own. Autonomy, while extremely attractive, rarely turns out well. Being the master of your own fate may sound appealing, but it always has consequences, most of which are far from pleasant. Over the last few chapters, we've seen a repetitive back-and-forth treatment of the lives of the two main characters in this story, David and Saul. One minute we're given a look into the life of David, and then the scene shifts to Saul. Sandwiched in between were the two face-to-face encounters between the two men, where David confronted Saul after having chosen not to take his life. Now in chapter 28, the two men appear together, but not physically. In these opening verses of the chapter, we're given a brief yet sobering look into what happens when men decide to disobey God and take matters into their own hands. While the author has gone out of his way to contrast David and Saul, in these opening lines, it's as if he's trying to show that both men have created unnecessary and uncomfortable circumstances for themselves because they have chosen to disobey God. David is living with the Philistines. Granted, he and his men, along with their families, occupy the city of Ziklag, in a more remote area within Philistia, but they are still considered vassals or servants of King Achish. In fact, King Achish was under the false impression that David and his 600 men were actually going out and fighting against Israel on his behalf. Where would he have gotten such an idea? From David himself. Each time David and his troops went on a raid, they would attack the enemies of Israel. But when they returned, they would report to Achish that they had been raiding areas within Judah. So Achish believed that David, because of Saul, had switched his loyalties and was now a faithful servant of the Philistines. Now David had to think of himself as some kind of genius. By moving to Philistia, he had escaped the constant pursuit of Saul, and he had a safe haven from which he could continue his attacks against the enemies of Israel. What a brilliant idea he had come up with. But his ingenious deception was about to blow up in his face, because the inevitable happened. The Israelites declared war on the Philistines, and King Achish turned to David, demanding that he join forces with him. King Achish told David, "You and your men will be expected to join me in battle." 1 Samuel 28, verse 1. The dream scenario David had created was about to turn into a nightmare. If he refused to go into battle against the Israelites, King Achish would realize that it had all been a ruse and that he had been tricked by David. If David agreed to fight with the Philistines, he would be attacking his own people and forfeiting his right to be their next king. He would be a traitor. So in the heat of the moment, David gave Achish an ambiguous commitment. "Very well," David agreed. "Now you will see for yourself what we can do." 1 Samuel 28, verse 2. David was forced to continue his deception of King Achish, delaying the inevitable decision he must make. And the king, unaware of what David was up to, and assuming that he had the full support of David and his men, gave David a rather awkward promotion. Then Achish told David, "I will make you my personal bodyguard for life." 1 Samuel 28, verse 2. David, who once served as the personal bodyguard of the king of Israel, was now the bodyguard for the king of the Philistines. Imagine David's embarrassment at having to try and explain this promotion to his men. It was a predicament to end all predicaments. He found himself between a rock and a hard place, and his circumstances were all his doing. He had no one to blame but himself. Well, what about Saul? He found himself facing a war against the Philistines, and he was missing one of his best warriors and 600 of his most battle-hardened soldiers because he had chosen to make David and his men outlaws. His incessant, obsessive attempt to take David's life had forced David to switch sides, or so Saul had concluded. Not only that, the prophet of God, Samuel, was dead, And God had removed his spirit from Saul, leaving him without divine direction. He was a king without a sovereign, to whom he could turn for help and guidance. So he assembled his men for battle. When Saul saw the vast Philistine army, he became frantic with fear. He asked the Lord what he should do, but the Lord refused to answer him, either by dreams or by sacred lots or by the prophets. 1 Samuel 28, verses 5 through 6. The prophet was dead, and God was not talking. David was AWOL. The Israelites were vastly outnumbered, and Saul was scared out of his wits. But this desperate situation had been of his own making. He was the one who had disobeyed God and failed to wipe out the Amalekites. He was the one who refused to wait for the prophet and offered sacrifices to God in direct disobedience to the law of God. He was the one who had refused to accept God's decree that David was to be the next king of Israel, and instead had repeatedly attempted to take David's life. Now it appeared as if David had sided with the enemy, and Saul was facing consequences that were a direct result of his disobedience and poor decision-making. And finding himself between a rock and a hard place, Saul would make one more ungodly decision, turning to a witch for help. God had made it very clear that this kind of activity was forbidden for the Israelites. If a person turns to mediums or necromancers, whoring after them, I will set my face against that person and will cut him off from among his people. Leviticus 20, verse 6. Two men, two different circumstances, but both found themselves in their own particular predicament because of disobedience to God. Rather than seek and submit to the will of God, they had determined to take matters into their own hands. Now they both were faced with the consequences of their godless decision-making. In his notes on 1 Samuel, Thomas L. Constable provides us with a sobering summary of what's going on here. This whole pericope illustrates that when opposition from ungodly people persists, God's people should continue to pray and trust Him for protection, rather than taking matters into their own hands. If we initiate a plan without seeking God's guidance, we may remove one source of aggravation and danger, only to find ourselves in another. Such plans may result in some good, but they may also put us in situations where we find it even more tempting to disobey God. We should instead remember God's promises and pray for His guidance.